passage for this morning is going to come out of Exodus chapter 19. So if you've got a Bible and coming to church with a Bible, it's an incredible idea that is highly recommended and encouraged. Why don't you open it to Exodus chapter 19? Exodus 19. Spend actually a decent amount of time, and not necessarily on purpose, in the book of Exodus, but we're going to be there again here this morning. And we've actually been a part of the story so far of the Bible in the book of Exodus, where God's people have been rescued from slavery. God's people have been brought out through the Red Sea. And now God's people have been brought to what's known as Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. So if you ever read in the Bible and see Horeb, H-O-R-E-B, or Sinai, it's describing the same place. And God's people are now going to have a very powerful encounter with the presence of God and receive, probably most famously, the Ten Commandments and the rest of the law. And this is a really powerful moment for God and his people. It's a covenant he's going to form with this nation to make them his in a very special way. So let's go from Exodus chapter 19 and process what we're reading. Exodus 19, verse 1 says, on the first day of the month, after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. And then Moses went up to God. And then the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to say to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you are to speak to them. The New Testament, by the New Testament authors, because they pick up on the gravity of this moment and what it means for us. New to church, if you're new to the Bible, one of the things that's very difficult to do is just pick up a Bible and start reading from the beginning. The beginning of the Bible, known as the Old Testament, is a story all the way from back in creation to the formation of humanity, the fall of humanity, God's rescue plan to restore them. But Jesus doesn't come until about 2/3 of the way through what's known as the New Testament. When many people try to read and understand the Bible, where they often get hung up is typically in Old Testament stories like this. Because it's written not to you, it's written to an ancient people in an ancient time, even in a very different language and context and culture, because it's even written in a very different literary style than anything we're used to in terms of modern literature. There's all things that can make it very fuzzy, difficult to understand. Cookies are not on the bottom shelf. And you can kind of pick and choose verses that seem like a fortune cookie, nice sort of idea, you know what I mean? But it's really difficult to make a coherent message or story come to life out of it. Now, once you get to Jesus, I think things get easier. I think Jesus is pretty poignant and clear, and there's a way that his words and teachings and all. But one of the things that Jesus said after his resurrection was he said, all of the Bible, from its very beginning, even to this point here at Exodus 19, was ultimately about me. And one of the reasons why people can read the Bible, even if they are a PhD level scholar studying the Bible, but yet miss its point, is that they miss him. And what is hard to do, exactly, well, where is Jesus in this story? Exactly how does he come out of this? This is a whole nation of people, been rescued from slavery, brought into a desert, standing at the foot of a mountain, about to receive stone tablets with the words of God and his commandments pinned on them. How does this supposed to point us to Jesus? And that's really the important question to ask, no matter where you are in the Bible. Because the point of the Bible is not basic instructions before leaving earth. It's not moral codes to make you nicer people. It's not just like life direction to help you navigate the tumultuous waters of what life often feels like. It's ultimately to bring you to Jesus. It's to bring you to God himself. It's to enter into a relationship with him where you know him personally, intimately, than anybody else. Where you could audaciously not just call him Lord or Master or God, but friend. Someone who's closer to you than anyone else you could ever imagine being. This is the point of the story. And This is where Exodus 19 picks up. That God rescued people not just from slavery and hardship, but he's bringing them specifically, in his own words, to himself. And he's about to allow his presence to be made known to them in a very demonstrable, powerful way. They're about to experience not only like a visual presence of God and an auditory presence of God, unlike anything they've ever encountered before. And at the mountain, God is desiring to enter into relationship with his people. And this is going to foreshadow for us the heart of Jesus and what he's going to fulfill and ultimately accomplish. Our ability to be reconciled to God and to have full access to him. The way these Israelites just had a sneak preview of what it might look like, Jesus is going to deliver the real deal. Talk a little bit about what Exodus 19 is telling us, how we can draw meaning from it in the light of Jesus for our own lives, because there's so many important things in this passage. It's why the New Testament authors, the apostles and so forth, why they picked up this story and why they inserted it even into our story as Christians, living at that point 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years from the Exodus, and now even for us remaining today. So let's start, first of all, let's start with the backstory. What's amazing about Exodus 19 is the backstory that God gives. Before he delivers the law to the people, he gives his 10 commandments, he gives them the backstory to remind them about why they got to where they are. And what he says was, hey, remember that I carried you on eagle's wings, meaning you were stuck and dead in slavery. And that's going to become not just a literal thing, that's going to become like this metaphorical thing of the way all of us get stuck in sin and spiritual brokenness. And what God says is, I rescued you. You didn't rescue yourself. I didn't give you an escape plan, and then you carefully followed it. I rescued you. And the language he uses is almost like a giant eagle that just carries its young with it on its wings. If any of you are super Bible or Tolkien nerds out there, this is actually the imagery that he picked up on in The Lord of the Rings when he had the massive eagles that would always show up in times of great distress in order to bring some sort of extreme rescue. And anyone who is a serious Tolkien fan will wonder themselves like, well, why did the eagles just not carry Frodo to Mordor from the very beginning? Nonetheless, and I digress. Have I not carried you on eagle's wings? So if you missed this, there was no point of you being here with us here this morning. I know that sounds really audacious, but if you miss this simple point of how this story is written, you will miss the entire point of Jesus. And anything else you'll try to accomplish via your church attendance or religious performance will all be in vain. That God rescued the people and then gave them the law. He rescued them on eagle's wings and then commanded them to obey. That was so powerfully important. And Jesus picks up on this idea so incredibly. And even the early apostles writing after Jesus were just doubling down on this time and time again with this very simple point. Where Jesus will differ from every other spiritual movement of some type or sort is this. We are saved and therefore we obey. We do not obey to therefore be saved. Meaning I'm accepted, so therefore I obey. I don't obey in order to earn my acceptance. That order is so critical because it's what the Bible will call grace, that God rescues you as a primary act that he initiates, that you don't cooperate with. He simply does on your behalf. And then, once he rescues you to himself. So rather than just liberating you to do whatever you want, he's liberating you from doing whatever you've wanted, which has only brought death. And instead, bringing you to himself. And when he brings you to himself, then, and only then, do you have the opportunity to do what the Bible calls obedience. Now, I get that anyone could just pick up the 10 Commandments and, quote, obey them. They're good ideas. They're great ideas. They're God's ideas. I suggest that you follow them. Not lying, the not murdering especially. That one's a big one you should pay attention to. But there's a big difference between trying to adhere to a law and obedience to God. And let me explain the difference. It's actually not complicated. It's called love. If I am performing or obeying God in order to attain anything from God, then my motivation in doing it might be fear, terror, it might be manipulation or control. It might be some sort of, in the end, selfish motivation of what I get out of God. Blessing, heaven, salvation, rewards, you name it. But if I believe that my obedience precedes my acceptance and salvation, no matter what I do for God, to him it'll never look like love. But if God initiates, if God loves us first, if he finds us while we're still in our sin, and if he brings us out of our spiritual Egypt, and then at that moment where he brings you to himself, and then from that point says, now obey me fully, now my obedience isn't trying to earn my escape from Egypt. I've already come out. I've already been forgiven. I've already been accepted. I've already been justified. I've already been adopted. Like all of the Bible words, which paints this beautiful picture of what it means to belong to God, now are true of me. Therefore, since God has such radical love for me, now I have the chance to respond in love back to him. Because anything that I do is certainly not paying him back. Anything that I do, what more can I earn from him? I've already received everything that matters. And now all that I have left to do is just love him back. And God graciously, here's the Old Testament and Jesus' view of the law. That the law is actually a bad interpretation of the Hebrew word Torah. Torah literally means instruction, not law. And so it's not God's laws of like moral compulsion that we have to follow. It's God's kind instruction, wait for it, for how to love him back. And y'all know how to do this. Somehow you just create this separate category with God. Because when you met your boo, in those early days, you did this exact thing. You became a student, an investigator, a detective for what would please that person, what makes them happy, for what you could do for them or with them or to them that would actually bring a smile to their face. That's what love does when it lays down your life for the well-being, benefit, or blessing of another. And when you love, and when marriages grow cold, it's because you stop doing it. Elbows to the rib cage or anything like that in church right now. But at the moment you stop investigating and learning that other person and what blesses them, because sometimes it evolves or changes over time, stuff starts going cold. You start into yourself like, well, they used to love me like this and don't anymore. And you just start thinking about the one-way street of how you're not receiving as much as you want. And you don't consider for yourself like, well, how do I love them better in this moment? It's not love. But I digress. Marriage seminar will come later. My friends, as complicated as we feel like the Bible is, as strange as the Old Testament can seem, as intimidating as the Torah or the law or instruction of God might feel, it's nothing more than God's instructions on like, I've loved you, love me back. Here's how you love me back. Here's what pleases me, blesses me. And it's not paying me back. It's not like you have this debt to owe that if you serve me for 1,000 years, it'll get paid off. It's just a love relationship. And love keeps like no record. There's no scorebook. There's no scoreboard to look to say, God has perfectly and radically done something for us that we could never do for ourselves. It's beyond our wildest dreams. And now, God says, obey me fully. So rather than the Old Testament being foreign, outdated, or irrelevant, it couldn't be more important. And Jesus is the one, at his arrival, that brings us the ultimate deliverance and freedom and salvation that all of Exodus just foreshadowed. It was his death, burial, and resurrection that is what purchased our freedom from slavery to sin and death, Satan and hell. And when we come to Jesus, simply trusting what he's done for us, not what we could ever do for him, then, love me back. And loving Jesus back looks like obeying him fully. Now, the literal Hebrew verbiage here is not obey. There's actually no word in the Hebrew language for obey, crazy enough. It's the word shema, which means to hear. So in the Bible, it's going to trip you out a little bit, but track with me here. In the Bible, there's no concept for obedience, just hearing God. Meaning, if you hear God and then don't do what he said, wait for it, you ain't hearing him. To hear him and then to like walk away as if like, well, that was a nice thing you just told me to do. Interesting. And then go do whatever you want. You ain't hearing him. Parents know exactly what this is like. You have heard the words that have come out of my mouth. And the word here is if you hear me, but also the Hebrew has no exclamation marks or words used for emphasis like really or fully. And so in order to emphasize something, they'll just repeat a word. So the literal wording here is, if you hear me, hear me. If you hear me, hear me. If you really hear me. If you obey me fully. Listen to what I say and do what I say. And there's this kindness and mercy of God to graciously teach his ignorant children how to wisely, generously, and lovingly live as they've been made to in the world. And then we get to go, by his own power and grace, do those very things. Exodus 19 could not be more about the Christian life. It is so powerful and beautiful. It is all about the grace and the love of God, and God's calling to love him back. And anytime we try to reduce Christianity down to a side hobby, a CEO version of Christmas, Easter only, where Jesus, God, church, or whatever just becomes a part of our life versus the consumption of our life, then obeying God fully never makes sense. But if you think Jesus only gave a little bit of his life for you, if you think Jesus only loves you like 10%, then that's exactly how you live. But when you look at the Exodus story and see in a very visceral fashion what he did and consummated in a much more grand and glorious fashion, there's only one logical conclusion: full obedience. And full obedience brings us to another terrible reality, Exodus 19. We fall pretty far short of that. So here's the second thing that happens at the mountain. God comes down in the mountain. He comes in a cloud and fire and lightning, peals of thunder. He comes in a voice that booms and a loud trumpet call. And their first reaction is utter fear and terror. I don't know who you think God is, if he's like super warm and fuzzy. Go read everywhere in the Old Testament up to people. It's pillars of fire. Ezekiel seems some kind of a vision, which he sounds like a madman for even attempting to explain. Because like if you could like interpret the literal Hebrew, what he's trying to tell you is like, so whatever I saw of God's presence melted my brain, and I don't have language that is adequate, and so I'm just doing my best to stumble my way through of describing what God's presence looked like, but all that it did was completely blow him away. When God's presence shows up in its raw power and beauty, it does appropriately do. Namely, in this story, it pushes them away. Do that. Actually, you understand why it would do that. You understand why it would do that. Why God's glory, and glory means God's importance, his weight, his significance. Why, when that is somehow seen with all of our five senses, why would that cause us to run away from him? Well, because somewhere deep inside, you know you're made in his image, you know you're made to be like him, and you know to be faithful to him. And when you see him and just how magnanimous and glorious he is, you start realizing very quickly how far short you've fallen, and the terror of that gap is something where you would beg for mountains to cover you, to keep you from having to encounter that in person. This is like Bible language. Now, here's how this plays out on a much, much smaller scale that maybe you might be able to relate to. So when I grew up, I typically found myself as like, if not one of the best players in every team I ever grew up with. Ever since I was like 3 or 4 years old, I picked up a bat or a ball or an oblong-shaped object, you know what I mean? And I could just do things with it that were better than all my peers. But as you get older, everyone around you gets better. And eventually, everyone comes to a point, except for a few rare individuals, where you start getting around people that are at least as good as you. Most of them are better than you. And what happens then? Here's the untold story of what happens in collegiate and professional locker rooms. Depression. Because my identity was based on being the best, and now I'm below average. And what do you do with that? My identity was being on the man, or I'm the woman, or I'm the go-to. And now I'm on the bench. And what do you do with that? It's the same thing that happens for Ivy League students. So I was just in Boston a couple weeks ago with a bunch of Ivy League's finest and best. And you hear all the stories about how much anxiety exists among so many students because from when they were little itty bitty, they had never once received a B. No Bs in their life, right? No Bs in their life, and yet when they come to Harvard, now professors have to rank them, and somebody's got to get a B. And heaven forbid a C. So what happens? Now you're barely hanging in. And student counselors at Yale, Harvard, they'll talk about basically having to perform counseling intervention sessions to keep people from completely crumbling in their self-identity and worth. Why? Because they had an encounter with a superior human intelligence. Now, if that's what happens to humans, when they encounter a superior human athleticism, or superior intelligence, or a superior human talent, they crumble into insecurity. What would happen if you encounter a perfect holy God? What happens when you encounter the one that you're supposed to reflect an image, and yet you realize you fall so far short, you're not even on the map? There's everything about you that emotionally and spiritually and mentally crumbles. At least this portion of the passage that we'll cover is going to finish. There then becomes a very visceral need. God has saved us. God's trying to walk with us, but there's a huge problem. And that problem is, me. And I fall so far short. And people are the most blind and deceived creatures, and that we so underestimate our cowardly tendencies, our selfishness, our moral compromises, and how we're willing to literally exchange anything and everything for the glory of God. Because you in your life are pursuing glory, things that you think that matter or have significance. It's called your family or your career, or goals, or your 5-year plan. But once you encounter God, you realize everything else is stupid compared to knowing Him. It's not only what you were made for, it's what He desires from you. And fight harder that would make any difference. Don't send us up the mountain. Don't send us up into that raging inferno of presence. Would you please just let Moses go up on our behalf? And so Moses becomes a mediator, someone that can stand on behalf of people in God's presence, delivering God's words to the people. And the book of Hebrews picks up this idea in the New Testament and says, we've come to a better mountain than the Exodus people did. They had Moses, who was one of the best that ever did it. But even he was imperfect, that he couldn't actually change the hearts of the people or anywhere near into the presence of God. He could go and relay what he saw and heard to them, but he could never bring the people into that same place. And what Hebrews says is now we've come to a better mountain, and we have a better mediator. And Jesus Christ is not just a better prophet. He is God Himself. And His mission, His agenda, was to bring us up the mountain, right into the center of that inferno. And we would all say, if we could see it properly, way. Jesus says, you are correct, and so here's what's going to happen. I will pay the penalty for all of your fallen shortness, And I will allow the vengeance and proper justice of God to come upon me, so that when my sacrifice is made, I can plead for you, and I can tell the Father that bring these people up because I paid the price. In Exodus 19, your heart is supposed to get you hungry. It's supposed to make you want something. It's supposed to make you want God and yet be terrified of God all at the same time. And by the time you come to Jesus, the glory of God, full of grace and truth, you realize that God has found a way to reconcile that gap between him and us. And though he is utter terrifying in his glory and perfection, he is also inviting and welcoming and including because of the blood of Jesus. I don't know if I fully appreciate exactly what the Bible's trying to tell me. That I've come to a better mountain, and I have a much better mediator. And that Jesus trumps Moses every day of the week. And that what I have is not just the ability to stand near to God and to listen to somebody tell me about God, but I have the ability to come to God and actually be right in his face. So let me just pause for the cause here. If that's all that church is to you, or that's as far as Christianity goes, a guy on a microphone tell you about God. I ain't him. I'm like Ezekiel. I would sound like a madman if I attempted to describe the beauty and amazingness of what God has done in me, through me, and for me. But God's heart is not that you would know him through me, or know him through your parents, or know him through your friends, or know him through anyone else. There's no other mediator that God desires to know you through other than his Son. And my invitation to you is simply this: that when God calls you up the mountain to be with him, to meet with him, to know him, and to encounter him, say yes. Let all the other things that you've deemed important fall in their priority compared to seeking God. If you're only here monthly, and that's as far as it goes, I'm not going to guilt you as if there's some performance you have to live up to satisfy God, because that's the wrong view of the law. I'm just here to announce to you, you have not had yet a proper encounter with the glory of God that would melt your heart, change your affections. Well, your love for him, it would wake up early in the morning to be with him. Praying would not become a chore anymore. It wouldn't be about the religious language that you have to perfect. It would simply be about the raw and vulnerable pouring out your heart to him. Worshiping God would not be an awkward thing that just feels like public spiritual karaoke. It would now become this opportunity where I get to give my Father something that blesses him and pleases him, because that is the only thing at the end of the day that I want. I don't need more of anything else other than him. And if you're here today and you're just thinking to yourself, like, I don't know that I've actually crossed into that place where God has done for me what he did for Israel, what he wants to do for us, then the answer is no. The answer is to simply trust what he's already done. And so whatever side of the Red Sea that you're on, whether you're standing at Mount Sinai, just cowering at a distance, having a spiritual life that feels a little bit mediocre or lukewarm, or you're all the way off in the distance, wondering if Jesus truly is worthy enough to give your life to. Friends, let's trust him. Because who else are you going to trust? And who has a better message? And who has a better mountain? And who has more grace? And who has a different message? Who wants love from you, not just your slavish obedience? Who wants you to know him? Who wants to be closer than a best friend to you? Who wants all of this? But the creator of heaven and earth, who sent his Son into our world to take on our problems and our sin, and on the other side reconcile us to that God and make sure that we could not just now but forevermore live on top of that mountain with this amazing God that we'll never get bored of and will always be intimate with, knowing the very purpose of our life fulfilled and satisfied in him. You were made by him and for him and in him, and every other thing you've chased in life is a vain chasing after the wind compared to him. And that's all that this tall white guy from Corvallis, Oregon can tell you. But Jesus is like, and it's come and see, come and follow, trust me, follow me, repent, turn away from your way, come to me, and then let the relationship begin.